Tyranny is a land of oblivion. That's the powerful idea that opens Jean-Pierre Filiu's huge work on the Middle East. And what it does is frame history as something more than just a collection of facts. It frames it as an act of rebellion, a rebellion against being forced to forget. This idea, right here, is the lens we have to use to look at the next 1,600 years of history.
Today, we are absolutely tackling an ambitious one, Jean-Pierre Filiu's Political History of the Middle East. And this isn't just a book, it's an epic journey. We're talking over 1,600 years, starting from the division of the Roman Empire in 395 and going all the way up to the crises we see in the 21st century. It's a massive undertaking. And honestly, getting a grip on Filiu's approach is the key to making sense of a region that, let's face it, shapes so much of our world today.
So how are we going to break this massive book down for you? Well, we've got 4 key questions that'll guide us. First up, what was the author's mission? Like, why write this book? Second, how in the world did he map out such a complicated and sprawling history? Third, what are the most important insights that we can really walk away with? And finally, we'll look at the book's biggest strengths and, just as important, its limitations.
All right, so that brings us right to our first big question, the author's mission. The history of the Middle East is not exactly new territory. There are tons of books about it. So you got to wonder, what new ground is Filiu trying to break here? What's the gap he's trying to fill with the history on this incredible scale?
And what's great is that Filiu is super clear about his goals. He's not trying to write a social history or a cultural history. His focus is absolutely laser sharp. It is all about power. He wants to dig into the mechanics of how states get formed, how borders are drawn, and why war has been such a constant, persistent feature. And this all ties right back to that quote we started with. For Filiu, tracing this political history is his way of creating that society of memory, to fight back against the oblivion that authoritarian regimes try to force on people.
Okay, so if that's the why, the next question is pretty obvious. It's the how. How on earth to organize 16 centuries of empires, caliphates, invasions, and revolutions without the reader just getting totally and completely lost? Well, Filiu's answer is what he calls a counterintuitive approach to chronology itself.
So instead of just running through all the dates you crammed for in history class, Filiu picks different turning points on purpose. For example, he says that the year 1501, when the Safavid dynasty was founded in Persia, is actually way more important for understanding the region's politics than the much more famous fall of Constantinople in 1453. And you ask, why? Well, because that powerful new Persian challenge is what pushed the Ottomans to go out and conquer most of the Arab world. See, he's looking for the engine of what happened, not just the famous milestones. A perfect example of this is how he handles the Crusades. He takes this event that we usually think of as one long story and just breaks it in 2. And by doing that, he can show us how, for a while, the real defining conflict wasn't about the Europeans at all, but about the intense internal rivalry between the 2 big caliphates in Baghdad and Cairo. And then later, bam, the whole game changes with the external shock of the Turco-Mongol invasions. This structure lets him argue that local power struggles were often way more important than the fight with European invaders.
So this unique structure, where does it lead? What new ideas does it unlock? Well, that brings us to the real meat of the book, its most powerful arguments. We've boiled them down to 3 essential takeaways that really challenge how a lot of us think about the history of the Middle East.
Okay, this first big idea kicks off with a phrase you might have heard before in European history, the Eastern question, right? This was the term European powers used in the 19th and 20th centuries for the problem of what to do with the Ottoman Empire as it was declining. But Filiu wants us to look at this from a completely different angle. He just completely flips it on its head. He cites the historian Arnold Toynbee and argues that for the last few hundred years, the real driving force hasn't been an Eastern question at all, but a Western question. This one idea, it reframes the entire narrative. All of a sudden, history isn't about the Middle East being a passive problem for Europe. No, it's about the Middle East being the arena where Western powers fought their own rivalries, forcing their own political ideas onto the region.
And listen, this is not just some abstract theory. Filiu lays out this pattern of intervention, and it is just chillingly consistent. It kicks off with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Then you get the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement that carved up the whole region for Britain and France. Fast forward to the Suez Crisis in '56, and then the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The point is, this history shows a repeating pattern where local crises get blown up into international ones, often with just devastating results for the people living there, a reality that is still very much with us today.
All right, the second big takeaway from this book looks inward. It confronts one of the most stubborn myths out there. As this quote says so clearly, The idea of a single, unified, monolithic Islam is, well, it's a fiction. And the proof has been sitting right there in the historical record for over 1,000 years.
I mean, for more than 200 years, you had two rival caliphates, the Sunni Abbasids in Baghdad and the Ismaili Fatimids in Cairo, and each one claimed to be the one true leader of all Muslims. That political and religious split alone proves there was no monolith, but the book goes even deeper, showing how distinct communities like the Druze and the Alawites emerged, each with their own unique beliefs. It was a world of competing powers and identities, all inside of Islam. And this is where it all comes together. The third key insight is that the one thread running through this entire history, from rival caliphs to colonial intervention, is the political struggle for power and the constant denial of self-determination, first by foreign powers and then by the brutal dictatorships they often left in their wake.
Okay, so we've looked at the why, the how, and the what, the mission, the structure, and the big ideas. So let's wrap up with a critical assessment. In this final section, we're going to look at what this book does exceptionally well and what, even by the author's own admission, it leaves out.
You know, the first and most obvious strength. You just have to look at the sheer scale of this thing. I mean, to coherently tell a story that covers more than 1,600 years of history, from the end of the Roman Empire all the way to today, that's just a monumental achievement. But it's more than just the scope. The book's biggest strength is that relentless political focus. By sticking to his mission of analyzing power, Filiu creates this clear narrative thread that you can actually follow through all those centuries. You can see exactly how a decision made by an Ottoman sultan in the 1500s or a British diplomat in the 1900s continues to shape the conflicts of today. He's particularly brilliant at drawing these lines through time, like showing how America's very first foreign war, the Barbary War in 1801, actually holds the seeds of its foreign policy challenges in the region right now. But look, with any strength, there's usually a flip side, right? And what's really impressive here is how honest Filiu is about the choices he made. He tells you this right up front. His intense focus on political history, on the state, on rulers, on armies, means that this is not a book about the societies themselves. And he's just as blunt about another major limitation. Because this is a history of state power for pretty much all of the last 1,600 years, it is, almost by definition, a history of men. He openly admits that. With very few exceptions, women only show up as the wives or mothers of powerful men.
So it's really important to see these not as failures of the book, but as deliberate choices. Filiu is basically saying, look, a history of this region from a social or gender perspective would be incredible, but it would have to be a completely different book. So as a reader, what you get is an incredibly sharp and detailed political history, but you have to know going in that you are not getting the story of daily life, of economics, of culture, or of the experiences of women. It is, by its very design, a top-down history of power.
And that leaves us with this one big lingering question, doesn't it? Filiu has given us this masterful, top-down political history of the rulers, the states, and the armies that have shaped the Middle East for centuries. But it leaves us all wondering, how does this grand story of power and conflict connect to the lives, the hopes, and the struggles of the hundreds of millions of people who are actually being ruled? And that question, that's maybe the bridge between this history and our present.